Hello, welcome back to the Gospel of John, and we are not in chapter 17, but chapter 18. We've moved on. So this is delightful. Um, so now we're going to be firmly into the Passion of Christ. And as I was pointing out throughout Jesus' speeches at the Last Supper, which is chapters 14 to 17, and then you also have the washing of the feet, which is also the Last Supper in chapter 13. So you have a big long chunk of John, 5 chapters long, about the Last Supper. So the gospel writers themselves, if you go to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, they'll be looking at this as kind of the start of the Passion of Christ. So Jesus, uh, well, yeah, I'll especially pinpoint it at the Lord's Supper, where you have Jesus Christ saying, "This is my body, this is my blood," and he's saying, "This is shed for you, for the forgiveness of sin." So he's already talking about his death at the time of giving the bread and the wine. So that's kind of the marker for when this begins. Is Jesus is being slaughtered at sunset as the Paschal lamb for that supper, but it has yet to occur at the cross. So for us, as we're coming into chapter 18, we're going to be moving away from the upper room, and we're going to be going out to the Garden of Gethsemane, where we're having a lot of the narrative action, whereas the last several chapters have been, well, dialogue. Almost all monologue by Jesus, but mostly speaking, now we're doing mostly action. Okay, so I will just lay out a few things before we begin, just to give you some idea of what's going on. So we'll be dealing with this. We'll be dealing with the section John 18, 1 to 28. And this pen isn't the best. It's better. Yes, much better. So John 18, 1 to 28. So I'm terming this section the betrayals. So as John's gospel, as I've been saying before, like you have a linear aspect to John's gospel, but also a chiastic aspect, which is basically trying to match the beginning with the end, like the second part with the second last part, and so on and so forth, till you get a climax in the middle there. So John does that, and he has that in paradise, so that occurs twice in the book. So really what you have is this nice structure. So this is the resurrection of Jesus over here. You have the resurrection of Lazarus over here. And then you also have the baptism of Jesus. Oh, sorry, no, yes, the baptism. Sorry, I was thinking about the crucifixion for a second. And we have been huddling over here in the middle of chapter 15. So this is love. There is no greater love than this, that the man lays down his life for his friends. That's the climax of the second part of John. So we've just been kind of moving along here for a while, and now we're going to be in the betrayals of Jesus. Any thought as to why this is plural?
There's more than one.
Jeff.
Yes.
You want to rephrase that?
Probably. Which betrayals are they?
Peter and Judas.
Well, Peter's.
Yes. As we have Judas here, and we also have Peter. And these are almost intermixed in the Gospel of John. But you also have a more more definite mixture of them over here, And this is with the washing of the feet. So in chapter 13, where you have the washing of the disciples' feet by Jesus. Well, actually, do you remember what Peter does when Jesus tries to wash his feet?
Says that wash.
Doesn't want him, Christ, to wash the feet.
Yeah, he's like, no, you shall never wash my feet, Lord. And then Jesus says, if I don't wash your feet, you have no part with me. And then Peter,
And then he says,
through Peter's
wash all
passion
of
goes,
me.
well, not only my feet, but my hands and my head. Do the whole thing. And then Jesus has to say no again to that. And in that exchange, you'll find that there's 3 corrections that Jesus has to do with Peter, which will now be matching Peter's 3 rejections of Jesus over here. But immediately after, you'll have Peter kind of rejecting the way that Jesus is trying to help him. You also have Jesus then saying, do you understand what I have done for you? I have made you clean even though one of you is not clean. And it's referring specifically to Judas. And this is where Jesus says, one of you is going to betray me. And there's a nice intimate scene there where John, who's writing the gospel, he's reclining at Jesus' chest. So he hears everything that's going on, whereas the disciples around them further out are not hearing this because they're starting to argue amongst themselves, like, who's going to do this? Who's going to betray Jesus? So John is like right there, Judas is right there, so they can hear what's going on, but the rest of them don't. So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's a lot of confusion about who's going to be betraying Jesus, but you have a lot clearer of a description of the event because John's right there. But with Judas, he's taking the piece of bread from Jesus, and then he goes out into the night, and the disciples, since they've been arguing amongst themselves, what else, they didn't hear that Judas was the one going to betray Jesus, so they thought that he was going to go and get more food or give money to the poor, something that Jesus sent him to do. So Judas receiving the bread, and Satan being possessed by Satan and going out into the night here. And we also have Peter going off. So that's what's going on parallel here. This is going to be interesting. I was looking into this a little bit yesterday as I was researching the Bible study. But this event comes up in chapter 7. So this is the Feast of Tabernacles. I'll probably be mentioning it a few times. But over here, Jesus appears at the temple in Jerusalem on the Feast of Tabernacles, as he's supposed to do as God-fearing Jew. And then he starts talking about his death and how the Jews are seeking to come and kill him, and then the Jews are going, what on earth are you talking about? And as discussions happen, then half of them want to kill Jesus and half of them think he's the Messiah. Part of that, though, and I'll be referencing this as we go through. Part of that is, since this is happening in the temple, you have the chief priests and the Pharisees right there, more in an inner room. So they're sending out officers to arrest Jesus and bring him to them. The officers don't because of the crowds in the way. But yeah, this is an attempted arrest of Jesus 6 months prior to here. Then the last little bit. And I don't expect you to know this terribly well. But this is part of the speech of John the Baptist to the disciples of the Pharisees, which we didn't cover because way back then, a couple of years ago, I didn't know that you wanted us to go, or you were allowing me to plot along as we have. So we actually skipped over this part, but You may eventually get back over it if you don't want to do that and you're absolutely tired of John by the end here. I'll just make a recorded study myself on this. But John the Baptist talks to the disciples of the Pharisees, and this is about the disciples being concerned with John because they're all somewhat all right with John, but now Jesus' disciples are starting to baptize people. So they're wondering, well, who's really in authority here? And John the Baptist, he very graciously steps aside and says, no, like it's the Son of the Father who gets to determine this. So if he comes from the Father, and this is exactly what must happen. He must increase that I might decrease, or I must decrease so that he might increase. Definitely the second one I said. So this is what's going on. Now, I do imagine in terms of, well, time and location, this is going to be very familiar. So whereas with, say, all the speeches we've done in John so far, some of these won't be as familiar to you because we don't necessarily repeat these every single year. So some of the sayings that comes up in John chapter 14 to 17 only comes up once every 3 years in our readings. But like this whole narrative of Jesus' passion, this comes up every single year in multiple services. So I expect you to have a better grasp of this than some of the other stuff. And it's more straightforward because it's a historical narrative than the speech where Jesus says something and your head spins. But there will be some interesting nuggets of wisdom as we go through. And as for the time, this is actually technically Friday. So it's at night. But for Jews, when does the day begin?
In the evening.
Sundown, there we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in the evening, the sundown. So as the sun goes down, that is the beginning of the new day, which is different for us. Sometimes we consider the beginning of the new day sunrise, although technically speaking, it should be midnight for us. So at this time, it is Friday, the day Jesus is dying, in the evening at night, but it's a very gradual coming of the day as Jesus goes forth. But this is Friday. I'll just put in brackets here, night. We don't have exact time, nor does it exactly matter at this point in time, because the important time markers start coming up as you go to Jesus going out to the cross. So that's also why I have the division here, is we have two time markers, one in verse 1 and then another one in verse 29. This is Jesus going out from the dinner. We don't have an exact time, but Jesus going out. And verse 29 is when he's in the very early morning at Pontius Pilate. So this is demarcated as his time with the Jews and being examined by the Jews. Okay. So as for location, we're actually moving around a lot. So first off, we're going from the Last Supper. This is going to be inside Jerusalem. It's in an upper room. Or inside Jerusalem to outside of Jerusalem, to the Mount of Olives. Any guesses to how far and how long they had to journey for this?
An hour.
Or okay, probably about 5 to 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And I ask that just because we hear the stories, but we don't necessarily have a grasp of the actual geography. Because again, we've only heard the stories and we can imagine anything we want in relation to them, but it's an ancient city. So the ancient city will probably have tens of thousands of people, maybe 100,000 people if it's a particularly big city. Rome would probably be one of the biggest cities of this time, like in the entire world. Like it's one of the biggest cities, and it would still have maybe 1 million, but probably less than 1 million. I'd actually have to look that up, but Rome would probably have about 1 million people, and it would be considered a mega city at this time. Like all the other cities are hundreds to thousands of people. So Jerusalem, fairly major city, a capital city, would have in the range of tens of thousands to maybe over 100, a couple 100,000. But it's still going to be relatively small. So all they need to do is just walk outside the walls, because Gethsemane, the Mount of Olives, is right outside the city walls. So you have the temple, a huge valley, and yeah, up the other side is the mountain. So it's actually, you can actually see it into the temple from that mountain.
You've seen this, huh?
Oh yeah, I walked up it.
Yeah.
It's pretty steep actually. And since there's been about 2,000 years worth of developments since then, there's a church supposedly where Jesus was at with Gethsemane, supposedly. Like, do we know for sure? Absolutely not. But best guess. And yeah, it is like 5-minute walk from the city gate, if that. So as you hear Jesus being moved around from, well, basically upper room to Gethsemane, then to the temple, then to, well, not even at the temple, but high priest's house, then from Annas to Caiaphas, and from Caiaphas to Herod, to Pontius Pilate, then Pontius Pilate to Herod, then back to Pontius Pilate, then you go back to, then you go outside the city walls, and you're like, oh, well, that's a whole bunch of different steps that's going on. Like, no, yeah, it takes like 10 minutes in between all those. So yeah, of course you can do that easily more than that. Well, we're going here to Gethsemane. Gethsemane. But since we're covering the betrayals, we're also going to the priest's palace. These will be the main features that I will be considering here for location. But yeah, Gethsemane, going down Kilbride Valley. Yeah, but I think we'll get into some of the details with the locations as we go through. All right. So any questions so far? Or comments or anything?
I got confused when you talked about the timeline, their dates. Like the day starting at night.
Yeah.
But we see Jesus was buried on Friday, so.
Yep.
That must have started Thursday night, some of his.
Yeah, so for the Passover meal, Passover is happening here on Friday. So you need to have everything prepared, and you're eating all this on Friday, which is the evening. What we would consider Thursday evening. But for them, that's Friday. Now, the important part of the Paschal meal is the lamb. The lamb is the high point of it. It's the sacrifice that everybody is partaking in, which is very unusual for a Hebrew sacrifice if you're reading through Leviticus. But everybody's partaking of the lamb, and you need to consume the whole lamb. And if you don't have enough people, invite more people. So Jesus, as the Paschal lamb, he needs to be slaughtered at twilight, because that's what's happening. So all the lambs are being slaughtered right at the end of Thursday, so right before sundown. And then people would be starting to have the meal in the dark. So when Jesus is giving out his body and blood through the bread and wine, that's when he's slaughtered. But you don't get that. He doesn't actually die until 3 p.m. on Friday. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, we'll be probably going through the timeline more as we go through this. Yeah. So let's start into the text itself. Yeah, so I'll read through verse 1 because I just want to kind of help you visualize things. So it's kind of situating you in time and space. So I want to give you the context of what's going on. And then we'll collectively read through the first following because that's all in the narrative sequence, but this is just establishing date and time and location. So verse 1 is when Jesus had finished praying. So keep in mind, Jesus was praying with the high priestly prayer, John 17, the whole chapter. So after Jesus finished praying at that time, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Okay. So John is leaving out information. This is because he has a relatively narrow focus, and it's slightly different focus than Matthew, Mark, or Luke. So, yeah, John doesn't talk about like what's going on in between the upper room and coming to the valley. But if you read through the Gospel of Luke, for instance, and Mark, Matthew and Mark, not Luke. With Matthew and Mark, they're commenting on all the discussions that are going on between the disciples en route to Gethsemane. And there's even a little bit there where Peter's again vowing to Jesus, saying, I will never betray you. And Jesus is telling him on the way to Gethsemane, no, you're going to betray me. But he has to tell Peter multiple times, no, you're going to be doing this. But John doesn't talk about anything there because he's very focused on the betrayals. Anyway, as for the Kidron Valley, that's what I was saying, like this is right outside of Jerusalem. So, and it is very literally right outside Jerusalem. It's right outside the city walls. So if you think of the city, and I'm trying to remember if I do have a map here. But in the city, oops, on the easternmost side is the temple. Oh, here we go. So on the easternmost side, you have the Temple Mount and the walls that drop off. So walls drop off, and you have the Valley of Kidron right there. So the Valley of Kidron is like many valleys that you'd have in Jerusalem. It doesn't have a lot of water in it, but it would be a slipstream for water during the rainy season. So you have a valley, but no water in it, but it is a riverbed, just by virtue of it being kind of desert-like conditions there in Israel. So right outside the temple, you have the Kidron Valley, so you have to go down to the base of the walls. So when you think about, for example, Satan trying to tempt Jesus to jump off the temple, like yeah, it's a huge drop. It is a huge drop.
Because it's actually overlooking that valley.
Yeah, because it's going off a wall into a valley.
Okay.
But on the other side of that valley, it's the temple is the highest point within the city of Jerusalem, so it's on the rocky outcropping there. On the other side, you have the Mount of Olives. So it goes straight up almost. or it felt like that when you're walking up it, especially in the heat. Oh my word. Okay, but you're going up, and on that mountain you would have some olive trees. Now John is silent about that because in the other gospel accounts they'll be talking about Mount Olivet, olives. So it is where you would have olive groves. But John doesn't mention that. He also, if you actually look at this, John also doesn't use the name Gethsemane at all. Yeah, I don't know if you noticed that. He doesn't use the word Gethsemane. It's the other gospel writers that do. But Gethsemane would have been a small location on the Mount of Olives. And thus far, Jesus has been spending a lot of time on the Mount of Olives the past week. In Luke, Luke mentions that Jesus and the disciples go out there every night since the triumphal entry. So for the past week, they've been amongst the trees. But there's a couple different ways to read that. Because John had mentioned that Jesus had went back to Bethany at one point. Matthew and Mark mentioned going back to Bethany at one point. So most likely Jesus is moving around in locations. There has been a warrant for Jesus' arrest for a few weeks now. And Jesus, so the Pharisees and the priests have been waiting for Jesus to come back into the area. And they want to arrest Jesus, but they can't do it with crowds. So of course the natural thing to do would be come in the middle of night, which Judas is doing. But they haven't done that. Why? Probably because Jesus is going out to Bethany or camping around in the middle of the trees in a forest on a mountain. So they can't find him to arrest him. So they need Judas to betray him in order to find out where exactly he is.
Well, when it says there was a garden, is that Gethsemane then?
Yeah, that would be Gethsemane. Yeah. So with the best guess of the Church of All Nations. So the Church of All Nations is at the base of the Mount of Olives. And the altar is supposedly the bedrock where Jesus stood praying with the disciples on the night that he was betrayed. They're guessing. So likely the garden would probably be lower on the hill, but you also have a few churches going up onto the hill. So it could be that it happened at any point on the mountain, but what people did with that church, the Church of All Nations, was say it's at the bottom. It's actually kind of cool being in the Church of All Nations because Christians from many nations across the world actually did come together to fund the building of that church. So you do have the old Canadian flag there. Like before we changed it to the red with maple leaf, we have the old Canadian flag in that church because Canadians help finance it. So that's nice. Okay. So the garden itself would be the Garden of Gethsemane. Oh, sorry, I should mention something else with the Kidron Valley. Kidron Valley is interesting, and there may be some symbolic significance to this. Do you remember anything about Kidron being mentioned in the scriptures?
Yeah.
About what?
Kidron.
Yeah.
Yes.
What do you remember about it?
Is it an Old Testament remembering?
Yes.
Yeah.
It says Hebron Spring on my map.
Okay, that would be. I can't remember that's north or south, but yeah, the spring would be feeding into the valley at different points.
Okay, yeah.
But there's other significance to the Kidron Valley. Because basically this is the only time when it gets mentioned in the New Testament is when the gospel writers are talking about it.
What, the dry bones? Was that the Kidron Valley?
Well, that's a good guess. It's not. That's a really good guess. So I don't think that valley was named in Ezekiel, but that's a really good guess. No, it's actually a far more obscure thing because it doesn't get mentioned too much in the Old Testament at all. But there were a few different occasions where a good king of Israel, or sorry, a good king of Judah, I should say. And there's very few of them, so this is a rare occasion. But one of the good kings of Israel would take idolatrous materials and burn them in the valley.
Yeah.
You'd also have, since this is right next to the Temple Mount, you'd also likely have some unclean elements of the sacrifices, so like their entrails and stuff. Most likely they would also be burned in that valley. So this is a place of refuse and a place of destruction of idolatry. So if you're thinking of idolaters being burned, this is actually to remind you of hell. So Jesus, in order to describe hell, like there's a couple different words in the New Testament. So the one that usually gets used to describe things as they are is Hades. Come on, man, why aren't you working? But you have Hades, and that's kind of the generic term for realm of the dead, which is why this is doubled up. Or the translation of Sheol in the Old Testament. So we have Sheol in the Old Testament, which we sometimes say during the Psalms. That's the realm of the dead, and that's what Hades is translated from. But Jesus, when he's referring to the fires of hell, the everlasting judgment, he's using the word Gehenna. Gehenna is a literal valley. So this is a real place that exists. But Jesus is using the term Gehenna to refer to hell because this is where you burn your trash, all the unclean things that you have. So when Jesus is crossing the Kidron Valley, where you would have some historical significance of burning idols and ceremonially unclean things, Jesus is crossing sticks, if you were, going to where there will be judgment in hell. So that's part of the context here that John is trying to bring out. Okay. Yes. So I did that. Okay.
You saying he's saying all that in the first verse?
Welcome to the Gospel of John. So now we're getting to the narrative itself. So let's read this as a whole, and we'll start picking at it piece by piece. But could somebody please read John 18 verses 2? Well, we won't get through the whole thing, but John 18 verses 2 to 9. Let's have 2 to 9.
When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was an olive grove, and he and his disciples went into it. Now, Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the grove, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. I told you that I am he, Jesus answered. If you're looking for me, then let these men go. This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. I have not lost one of you gave me.
So yeah, we'll stop there and we'll get to Peter in due time. But we'll focus on Judas here. Okay. So John begins with Judas, who betrayed him, and it's a little bit odd that this is in the past tense. The actual verb is a present participle, so it means now Judas, who is betraying him. So John is putting this right in the present. So it's Judas, who's betraying him right now, right at this place, is coming. So Judas is in the process of betraying Jesus. So John's trying to make this a very active and active voice.
And yet he didn't mention the kiss.
Nope. John doesn't mention a number of things. You also notice that he skips right to Judas and doesn't talk about Jesus praying to the Father in the garden. Yeah, because John seems to be having a very particular focus. And the focus is more on the issue of Jesus' messianic kingship. And that's also his authority and his protection of the disciples. And that's going to be dominating the next couple chapters, is Jesus as king, the true authority. So Judas coming in here, yeah, John is skipping over Jesus looking to the Father to pass the cup from him, because John is trying to focus on the more heroic aspects of Jesus, I guess you could say. He's the one who's standing up to Judas and protecting the disciples right now, rather than him berating the disciples for not staying up and paying attention. John is also the kindest to the disciples out of all four gospel writers. The other gospel writers usually comment about how they're arguing amongst themselves or making some stupid comments, and sometimes even speaking against Jesus. John doesn't focus on that. I wonder why.
That's why Jesus loved him the most. He was the kindest.
Maybe. I don't know. Anyways, yeah, so John skips right to Judas. And Judas knew the place. So most likely, yeah, Jesus and the disciples were coming here. And there is that one note, Luke chapter 21, verse 37, which suggests that he and the disciples were even sleeping off in the amongst the trees of Gethsemane at different times during Holy Week. Hard to say absolutely for sure, because it's using a Hebrew term of phrase where it's they dwelt in the mountain. And what does "in" mean? Because that could mean a few different things, because you could be like on the actual mountain, you could be in the trees, it'd be on like in a building on the mountain, you could there's a whole bunch of different ways to actually translate that, and like it all comes up in different ways in the Old Testament, but yeah, at least at some point in time they're there.
Yeah. Been to Cappadocia, there's holes in the mountains, so
I'm trying to remember if it was
it's an underground city too. It's carved out of limestone, right?
No, right.
I can't
Quite
remember.
big areas.
I remember there being caves in the Mount of Olives. Not to say that they aren't there, but I don't remember seeing any. Yeah, I can't say guarantee to that. Yeah. And there's also not much of a guarantee that the modern look of the Mount of Olives would be exactly how it would look in the ancient period. Like there's been so many different developments over the years and scraping away of rock and other stuff. So there might have been a cave or something that they could have also used. Don't know. I don't know. Need an archaeologist to weigh in on that. Okay. So yeah, as I mentioned before, most likely because they're on the mountain, they're also in Bethany at least once, as mentioned by Mark and Matthew. It could be the case that they're moving around and thus, even though they're like right out there in the open, the Sanhedrin hasn't been able to arrest them, so they needed Judas to come. So Judas knew the exact place where Jesus would be. So now he's the one who is leading the troops there. Okay. So Judas came guiding, it says here, a detachment of soldiers. That's not necessarily the best translation, because John uses a term. I'll write this for people's reference. So John uses the term cohort. And this doesn't really mean much to you because you'll say like, oh, somebody has their cohort of friends, and you might think like maybe a handful of friends. Not exactly. So what you'd have is you'd have a Roman legion, and this is roughly equivalent to 2,000 armed soldiers. A cohort is roughly, or I'm using a different pen. A cohort is roughly equivalent to 600 soldiers. And Romans aren't too picky about this, so you might have usually less than that amount. Now, it seems incredibly unlikely that Judas somehow was able to persuade the Romans, when Pontius Pilate has no idea who this Jesus guy is, to send 6,000 troops to arrest, 600 troops to arrest him on the Mount of Olives. That is incredibly unlikely. So more what John is probably saying is within a large soldier group, maybe hundreds of guys, some of that group came out to arrest Jesus. This is most likely what he's saying. And we also have to be careful about the use of the word cohort, because when I was reading commentaries, the commentaries were like just automatically assumed, oh, well, that means that you got the Romans in on this. Again, Pontius Pilate doesn't know who this guy is. This is going to be incredibly evident as we go through the chapter. Pontius doesn't know who he is. So why would he devote a whole bunch of military resources to Jews he hates? Because he also hates the Jews. Remember also how, again, hours from now, he's putting a sign on Jesus' cross just to take them off. So no, he's not giving a huge amount of military resources to Judas to betray Jesus, who's leading an unarmed rebellion, or presumably an unarmed rebellion that Pontius Pilate has no idea about. So no, that's incredibly unlikely. But what is more likely is there is some sort of detachment of the temple guards, because the Jews do have a not exactly a military force, but they do have, I guess you could say, a religious police force policing just the temple area. So they do have something. And this would be under the direction of the high priest. And we saw this a little bit earlier with the Feast of Tabernacles, John chapter 7, where they send out officers to arrest Jesus. So when we come here to chapter 18, we have Judas coming with a cohort, also with the officers. This can also be translated as ministers. So people who would have kind of relatively more secular power and authority to police things. So this would be as if well, maybe not. If we had a board of properties, that would be like me sending out Christian and Alex to shoo people off the lawn for like camping out there, something like that. That would be more or less what this is, where they're ministers within the temple, so they're helping things out, and then you'd also have guards who are trying to protect things. So why would you have guards in the temple? Well, you have different spaces in the temple which need to be secured. So you have the court of men, the court of women, the outer courts where the Gentiles can go. So you would also have people standing in between there to make sure that you don't go where you're not supposed to. The commentary I was reading said that those fellows are usually unarmed. So John could be mentioning coming with weapons just to say, oh, well, now they're trying to they're trying to make excessive force. They're trying to have excessive force, whereas they don't normally do this. Otherwise, if you have a Roman cohort, you just assume that they have weapons because they're Romans. Like, why would a soldier be anywhere away from their sword and shield? But if John's mentioning this, well, maybe it is just a Jewish force. So that's my argument. As I said, different commentators on the Bible, like Morris that I've been using, he disagrees with me, but this is how I'm reading the text. Okay. Yeah. So John mentions the soldiers, again, kind of loose definition of soldier here. Some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees, yes, they did have people like this at their disposal as the Sanhedrin, the ruling religious body here at the time, because the Romans didn't want to displace the religion entirely, because they still wanted to have proper control of the people. However, in a few decades, this goes out the window and the Romans destroy the temple. Anyway, and John mentions that these people were carrying torches and lanterns, also weapons. So torches and wait, did any of these translate this as lanterns? Why are you translating this lanterns? What? Okay, so they wouldn't have lanterns at this time. They would have oil lamps. And if I had thought ahead, I would have grabbed the mock oil lamp out of my office. But it's a little clay thing that you'd have oil in and a wick, and so you'd have that lamp. You'd also probably have torches. John uses the generic word lights, so that most likely means torches. And to me, that also reads as this is kind of last minute force, because if you were planning this ahead of time, normally you would be able to grab something. Like you'd have everything in common, so you're like, okay, we're going to go out to get Jesus. How many torches do we have? And you're going to get a number of torches. You're going to have a number of weapons, and blah 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 blah. So if you're having a mixture here, that seems to me this is almost ad hoc. I could be wrong on that, but yeah, I also wouldn't necessarily want to just have a oil lamp. trying to search a forest with an oil lamp. So again, this is why I'm thinking it's a little bit more ad hoc. And John uses a very generic term for weapons here. So he doesn't even mention the type of sword. So unfortunately, we can't use the type of sword to try and discern, is this, again, an ad hoc kind of militia force, or is this more of a professional Roman military? But he uses the generic term for weapons. Okay. Also absent from the Gospel of John, but you'll But in the other gospel writers, Jesus says, "Why are you coming out here with swords to try and attack me as if I'm leading some sort of rebellion?" Yeah, John doesn't mention that, but yeah, they're coming out with weapons as if Jesus is leading an armed rebellion, which he absolutely has not done or recommended. Okay. So before we get into the next major subject, which is a huge major subject, any questions about Judas or the force that he brings?
How could he be so sure that uh, that he would be at that particular place? Was it just such a regular place that he figured that's where he'd be?
I would assume so. There's also no good reason to say that Judas doubts he could capture Jesus, because if Jesus really wanted to stop Judas, he could have done so right at the Last Supper, because all he needed to say in completely unambiguous terms, which is not a thing Jesus does, really, but all he needed to say to the 11 guys standing around him, "Hey, this one over here is going to betray me. Tie him up and leave him outside," or something. That's all Jesus needed to do. And then Judas has to fight off 11 guys. One of them being Peter, who's apparently armed right now.
Right.
So, yeah, Judas might actually. So, since Jesus sent him away into the night and told Judas, "Do what you're going to do," Judas probably has no reason to doubt that this is going to happen.
Um, um, when Jesus told them, "Go and do what you're going to do," do you think Judas thought that Jesus knew what he was going to do, or
Yes.
thought it was something else?
No, he knew. Again, he has no reason to doubt that. So Judas has been following Jesus around. He knows that Jesus has divine omniscience to a degree, at least. So he knows that Jesus knows things in the future, that he can predict things. And since Judas is also possessed by Satan at that time, well, Satan definitely knows who Jesus is and what he can do. So there's no doubt in my mind that Judas knew that Jesus knew what was happening. Okay. So now we're moving into verse 4. And if you thought there's so much in the first verse, get ready for what's to come. So Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, and again, this is in the present tense. So John is bringing this very much into a more forceful action, because when you read history or when you read novels, usually it's in the past tense because you're reading something as if it has happened. But putting it into the present tense is meant to jar you so that you're living the action alongside everybody who's going through it. So John isn't intentionally trying to. Jesus knows all this. So Jesus goes out. So we have here, Jesus went out and asked them, but Jesus goes out. Okay, so if there is a warrant out for your arrest, people have been, for the past few years, threatening to kill you. And you start seeing this mob and you can definitely see them because they have a whole bunch of lights and they're coming like down a ramp into the Kidron Valley. So you can see them from the mountain, like it's pretty easy. Is your first instinct going to be going out to greet them?
No.
No.
Going, running, and hiding.
Yes. So they would actually probably have to search the entire mountain in order to try and find Jesus. And meanwhile, like there is the possibility that Jesus could have just led the disciples out and hid them somewhere else. There's also the instance, when was this? 4 or 5 months ago. when Jesus is at the temple for Hanukkah. This is in John chapter 11. So no, John chapter 10. John chapter 10. So Jesus is at the temple at Hanukkah, and people are trying to grab him to stone him, and then Jesus just walks straight through the entire crowd. So if Jesus wanted to, he could readily avoid this, but he goes out quite deliberately.
Because he knew it was his time.
He knows what's going to happen, including his death. But of course, he also knows the resurrection. But he knows everything that's going to happen, so he goes out. Okay. So, can you think of another instance in the Bible where there are people hiding in the garden from an authority figure?
Adam and Eve.
There we go, Adam and Eve. This is very interesting. So Jesus is going out from the garden, whereas if you look to Genesis chapter 3, where this is happening with Adam and Eve. So what happens with them is Genesis chapter 3, there we go. What's happening with them is they ate of the fruit of the tree. Their eyes were open. They know that they were naked. They covered themselves with fig leaves. And then the Lord God came to walk in the garden. Adam and Eve knew this. Possibly God is also shining with the glory of God, and maybe he's coming with light. It's silent on whether or not there's a lot of light at this time. But anyways, God is walking around in the garden, and Adam and Eve hide themselves. So rather than going out and facing judgment as it's coming, they go away. They go further away from God.
Pastor.
Yep.
God is walking in the Garden of Eden.
Yep.
And he has a body. Would he be the pre-incarnate Christ?
Most likely.
Never thought of that.
And now I'll just make a little bit of comparison. I'll use a different color. Hopefully this will be more visible. We have Adam. Actually, no, I'll rephrase this. We have the first Adam. And you have the second Adam, who's Jesus. Okay. So already we have on here hiding goes out. You also have God seeking. And we have Satan, again possessing Judas, and evil men seeking. Okay. So why is the first Adam hiding in the garden?
Because he has sinned.
Okay, he knows he's sinned, so he has sin. But if he knows he has sin,
He doesn't want to be seen because he's naked.
well, yeah. Yeah. So this is where I'm going. So you have sin, you have guilt, and then also with the nakedness, shame. Okay.
So
Does
before
Jesus have any of that?
no.
No. So what is Jesus? So if Jesus is not sinful, he is
Pure.
Holy, pure, righteous.
pure. I was looking more for righteous, yes. But pure and holy are definitely in the mix there too. John at this time, he's going to be focusing a little bit more on the righteousness aspect of Jesus, that there's no fault in him, which is why Pilate wants to shoo Jesus away, because he can't find any fault in the guy. There's no guilt. So why would he execute this guy without any guilt? And then the question of holiness actually does come up at that time too, because then he gets a whiff of Jesus actually being God in the flesh, and Pilate, who has a whole bunch of stories of gods in his religion being incarnate in some way or being born of God. You have many children of gods in Pilate's religion. He gets scared. So he's recognizing, the righteousness and the holiness as opposed to this. So what does the first Adam think will happen to him if he gets found?
Punished?
How?
He probably doesn't know how, but he just feels like he's going to be.
Death?
Death, yeah, because God told him how. If you eat fruit of the tree, you will die. You will die.
Yeah.
So you have punishment of death. Okay, so for the second Adam, Jesus, what he's facing, what would happen to him if he goes out?
He's going to
Gonna die.
Yeah.
He's going to be killed.
So you have death here. But this is kind of a trick question. So is this a punishment?
Well,
Yes.
And no.
Yes.
Yes and no.
But punishing him for righteousness, that doesn't.
yeah.
It's not punishment for him, it's punishment for us.
Well,
He's
sort
taking
of.
on our punishment.
Yeah, he takes on our punishment.
Yeah.
So this is kind of the trick question. So it's an unjust punishment, whereas this is a just punishment. I should probably put that just punishment. This is an unjust punishment. And 1 Peter chapter 2 gets into that a lot, where Jesus is he's punished for being righteous, therefore God will exonerate him as one who is righteous and holy. Okay. So this does come up at the end of what we had just read. But I don't know how to phrase this in a good question for you. So Jesus is protecting the disciples. Okay.
Laying blame.
So who is Adam protecting?
Laying blame. He's not protecting anybody.
No, he's protecting himself.
Yeah.
And he doesn't really know how to do it because God calls him and he just answers because it's like, oh no.
I have a question. Is there an indication that before
I just want to finish my thought on this.
Okay.
So he's protecting himself. So if you read through Genesis and look also to the verbiage, especially in the Hebrew, it's Adam and Eve heard God walking in the cool of the day, and they hid themselves. So the actual phrasing suggests that they hid away from each other. They actually ran away from each other and hid individually. So Adam is definitely protecting himself. He's not even just answering for Eve when he comes out, but he is absolutely out to protect himself, even at the cost of Eve, potential cost of Eve, which is very different from Jesus.
Well, if you could even go further, because he actually blamed Eve, and then Eve
Yeah.
blamed the protecting himself by sacrificing somebody else.
Oh, actually, that's a pretty good move. By sacrificing wife. Protecting disciples by sacrificing himself. Okay.
The question that I had, and it's maybe if I read Genesis right now, I would have the answer, but is there an indication that before Adam and Eve sinned, that it was a regular thing that they walked in the garden with God?
We don't have a word on that.
Uh-huh.
I don't think it's impossible. The implication of Satan's question, though, when Satan asked Eve, did God really say not to eat of the fruit of this tree, seems to be that there is some element of doubt. So it could have been that Adam was the one instructing Eve not to eat of the fruit of the tree because God says so, but Eve had not herself personally heard it. So that's supposed to be the implication of the question.
Mm-hmm.
At which point that would suggest that God is not regularly interacting with them in that way. But we have no firm word one way or the other. So I'll say there's an implication, no, but it's still absolutely possible that he does.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's a standard theological question. You know, I don't know. Anyways, yeah. So we have a whole bunch of different things comparing the first Adam to the second Adam, and like this is all trying to protect oneself, all motivated by sin, whereas this is trying to protect others and sacrificing yourself for them based on your righteousness. So this is God properly seeking somebody and them failing in coming to God, whereas God goes out to see those who are seeking to kill him, to go against him, and thus trying to exonerate them and save them from themselves.
How does this timeline, I say, relate to Judas and the kiss? Like here you have Judas going out, but
Yeah. So this is something that I was trying to look into a little bit. I think I need a note somewhere. Yeah, here we go. So I will bring up the text so people online can see and make a comparison for themselves. So the kiss comes in with Judas's greeting to Jesus. So we see this in Matthew and Mark. Luke actually has Jesus making the first comment, like Jesus praying while he. Now all three of them, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all say while Jesus was speaking, then that's when Judas arrived. Luke has Jesus speaking to Judas at the beginning, do what you're supposed to do, what you want to do, whereas Matthew and Mark have Judas going, Rabbi or Rabboni, and then going in for the kiss. So it's hard to say if Jesus's or Judas's comment was first, whether Judas was just trying to generically still pretend, or Jesus hears that pretending and then goes like, no, I'll just do it anyways. Or if Jesus just says, do what you're going to do, and then Judas is just kind of acting the fool to the last bit, trying to just kind of give it a little bit more insult. It's hard to say which one's first. But in all that, it is still a designator of who exactly Jesus is. So you'll notice in verse 4, Jesus went out and asked them, so plural, looking to not just Judas, but all of them. And he says, who is it that you want? And they say Jesus of Nazareth. So that's at this point in time, do they know that this is Jesus, the guy who's going out to talk with them? No, because Jesus is saying, who are you looking for? They say Jesus, and Jesus says, I am he. And if you were a disciple trying to protect Jesus, what would you do? You'd lie and say you were Jesus, and then there's so regardless of what's going on, they still can't be sure that this exact guy is Jesus, because it could be one of the disciples faking. So most likely they still need Judas to designate him with a kiss even after this. So my guess would be that the kiss of Jesus would actually be right after this exchange with Jesus and all the men saying that they're seeking Jesus. So Judas is coming in for the kiss to say, yeah, absolutely for sure this is the time. That's how I read it.
And didn't Judas
It's up to
say,
interpretation.
didn't Judas say that he's going to kiss the man that didn't he announce to the,
Yeah, no, this is what we're talking about is, yes, Judas did tell them, but Judas still needs to kiss Jesus. So if some guy in that group comes out and says, I'm Jesus, will you actually believe this person? So they still need Judas to kiss the guy. To
Probably
say,
didn't.
for sure.
Probably didn't help that it was dark out.
lights?
Well, torchlight and also keep in mind this is the era before eyeglasses.
Right.
So, anyways, my guess would be the kiss is coming in right at the end of this exchange. But hard to say. Hard to say. Okay. So we have in here Jesus going out, and that going out can actually remind us of Jesus being far superior to the first Adam. So again, a lot of stuff that can be packed into one simple phrase there. And now we're getting into another one. So Jesus says, well, NIV translated as, who is it you want? It's actually just two words in the Greek, which can be translated as, who do you seek? So Jesus is using the word seek. There's been a lot of seeking in the Gospel of John. This is actually a very common theme throughout the Gospel. Do you remember who seeks Jesus and why?
Oh, a number of people.
Okay, but which people?
Family of Lazarus.
Nicodemus?
Well, Nicodemus doesn't come up in John.
Cripples, the blind?
Remember in the story of Lazarus if the word gets used. Because Jesus appeared to the family of Lazarus. Mary goes out to kneel before, well, Martha and Mary at different times go out to kneel before him. I can't remember if the word to seek, and you might not even be able to find it there in the English translation because it would be the Greek term that holds significance. So I can't remember if it does. Let me just quickly check that.
Royal official went to in Cana went to him and begged him to come and heal his son. That's one.
Pharisees.
Pharisee. And yes, the guy did in common parlance seek Jesus, but John doesn't use the Greek term. So unfortunately, I'll say no to that. But there we go. The pit. So the Pharisees seek him, but they're not the main ones. Usually it's just the Jews. The Jews are seeking Jesus. So why are they seeking Jesus? Do you remember?
You want to question him?
They want to make him king.
Both correct. Both the minor usage. There's something else that they do repeatedly to seek him for.
Get stuff from him. Want to be
Oh.
like they want to be healed. They want to be fed. They want to.
You're thinking of the other gospels. gospel writers. That's not, that would be how they would use it.
Yeah.
Just check the Lazarus. Does not use the term for the family of
It
Lazarus.
was a
No.
young girl that he brought back from dead too.
Not in the Gospel of Lazarus. That's with one of the other
Some
gospels.
song. So
So they're seeking
To kill him.
to kill him. Yes, that is a repeated thing that happened in chapter 5 and 6 and 7 and 8. Not 9, in 10, in 11. Yeah, so one of the repeated themes throughout the Gospel of John is that the Jews, those who are outside of Christ, they are seeking Jesus to kill him. So when Jesus is asking, who do you seek? He's also knowing exactly what they want. And they're seeking to kill him, absolutely. But as you also mentioned, that there's a couple different seekings. I'd like to make him king. So there's also the misunderstandings that people have where they want Jesus to fulfill a certain role. So there's a few times where it comes up where they're seeking Jesus for some sort of answers, glory, or something. But every single one of those times, it ends up with them then trying to seek Jesus to kill him. Yeah. So, and I'm trying to remember. And there's also one instance of people rightfully trying to seek Jesus, and this is the disciples trying to seek Jesus. And Jesus says, "You will seek me, and where I go, you cannot find me." He also says that to the Jews. He says in chapter 7, again, at the Feast of Tabernacles, so one of the parallel texts in the Gospel of John. So he tells the Jews, "You will seek me, but you will not find me, for where I am going, you cannot come." And we know now Jesus is referring to his ascension to the Father and his death. But the Jews at that time are going like, "What are you talking about? Are you going amongst the Gentiles and we won't be able to find you amongst those unclean heathens?" But Jesus is saying, yeah, the ones who seek me, they will not be able to find me because they're not worthy of heavenly places. So they're the sinners who will not come. So when Jesus is knowing everything that's going to happen to him, and he's asking, "Who do you seek?" he knows exactly the intent of the heart and what they want to do. And he also knows that they won't be able to really come after him. They'll kill him, but they will not come after. Or actually, technically speaking, Jesus lays down his own life. They don't even actually kill him.
So when he says, "Let these men go,"
Yep.
who are the men to be
The
let?
disciples.
Disciples.
Oh, okay.
Yep. We have some time. I don't know if we want to get into the next subject. It's kind of a big. Or I don't know. Actually, I got through more than I thought I would. Well, we can at least look at the response. So, the troops and the officials, they reply. Presumably, also Judas is among them. Maybe not joining in the reply, but they say Jesus of Nazareth. Now, this is a little bit unusual because you don't really hear Nazareth being used all that much, except for as a place name. So, the important part here, though, is they have to designate who on earth they actually are looking for, because if you're looking for Jesus or a Joshua, this is either the first or second most popular name among Jews in this time period. So you need to be more specific. So they're looking for the Jesus who comes from Nazareth.
I'm still a little confused why they would want to detain the disciples, because it was Judas that gathered this band of soldiers together.
Yeah.
Why did he want to hold the disciples?
Okay, so if somebody's leading a rebellion and they have a lot of guys behind them, would you then say, oh yeah, let's just take out their leader and ignore all these guys who are following him?
No, they'd kill them all.
I guess.
Yeah.
But Judas was one of the disciples, so.
Oh, he's betrayed him. He's showing that he's on the side of the Pharisees and well, the Sanhedrin in general. Yeah. So it doesn't matter because he already flipped sides.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyways, so yeah, they have to designate Jesus of Nazareth, and you'll notice that they're using Nazareth, but when Jesus is in the Galilee region, they use a different way to describe him. So they call him Jesus, son of Joseph. So this also just kind of shows they don't really know who Jesus is, so they're going by place name rather than father. So they don't know the family, they just know this is where he's from. At which point you can connect this to another mention of Nazareth in the Gospel of John. So this is where Nathaniel, at the very beginning of the Gospel, where he's hearing from Philip, oh, we've found the Messiah. It's a Nazarene, and then Philip goes, can anything good come out of Nazareth? So this is also kind of playing into that, where they're going like, no, nothing good can come from Nazareth. Oh, actually, it also comes up another time. It is in chapter 7, where Jesus, again, the parallel account of chapter 7, Feast of Tabernacles, where Jesus is at the temple and the Sanhedrin is sending soldiers after Jesus, but can't get to him because of the crowds. So part of that is the crowd is debating, well, is Jesus actually the Christ or not? Is he the Messiah? And some of the naysayers are claiming, well, he's coming from Nazareth. The Messiah does not come from Nazareth. He's not born in Nazareth. And that's, again, because they don't know Jesus that well, because he was actually born in Bethlehem, which does fulfill prophecy. But yeah, you can tell that the people who are coming out here against Jesus, they don't exactly understand who this Jesus guy is.
When he says, I am he, is that I am statement?
Okay, we're getting into it.
Oh.
All right. So, all right.
Another I am statement.
So Jesus has a reply. And he simply says, I am. So the NIV adds in their word he, and they really shouldn't. But I think they're just trying to make things more accessible, but in making things more accessible, they're also downplaying the importance of what Jesus is saying. So in the Greek, it's only I am. So Jesus is claiming the divine name, and that is Yahweh, the I am who I am. But this is somewhat without context for these assailants, because if somebody, because if I ask, hey, are you Mel? And you go, I am. I was just gonna go, okay, and I don't assume that he's making a divine statement, even though I have all the biblical background to know that's what the divine name is. So this could be confusing for the guys, but we'll quickly see that this has some power to it. Anyway, so Jesus is
that why they fell down to the ground?
I'm getting to that. So Jesus is saying, I am.
yourself there.
You'll also notice John is laying into it. So in the next verse, where John has an explanation where he says, when Jesus said, I am, they drew back and fell to the ground. And then again, he asked them, who is it that you want, or who are you seeking? They said, Jesus of Nazareth. And he said, I am. So in John's text, we have a threefold use of the divine name.
The Trinity.
Father, Son, and Holy Ghost.
Well, Jesus isn't claiming to be all three persons of the Trinity. That would very much confuse the person. That would be heresy. No, but three is the number of God.
Okay.
So John is bringing this up the third time with his note, because Jesus only said it twice. But John is bringing it up the third time just to draw attention to the divine nature of this. So he's not trying. So John isn't trying to hide the fact that this is really what's going on. Is like if I ask Mel and like, are you Mel? And he says I am. Well, he says it once, and that's fine. But what John is trying to do is he's trying to say, like, no, there is something more going on here. Okay. All right. I will get to the comment about Judas in due time. But there is, when Jesus says this, for the sinners, they draw back. The verb is kind of more, they go away. And I've used translating it as to draw back, because it's not like they just completely leave the garden and then they eventually come back and go, like, oh, he said he is the person that I'm looking for. Well, let me just go and leave for a while. No, yeah. So then he's translating this as draw back, because they're not completely leaving. Okay. So this is interesting. As with any of the phrases of John and the word uses. So
Yeah.
yeah, here we go. Okay.
Two. They went
Oh,
backward.
no, that's what.
They went backward.
There we go. Right page. Okay. So they draw back and they fall to the ground. So with the word itself, there doesn't seem to be any particular significance to the word, because the word behind this in the Greek is all over the place in the New Testament. So with the specific word, maybe not that much importance in the Gospel of John, although it is used in the triumphal entry. And again, there's many usages in the Gospel of John, but the one that really attracted my attention was the one usage in the triumphal entry. This is John 12:19, where the Pharisees, when they're seeing Jesus going into Jerusalem and they're seeing the crowds following him, they're saying, look, the world is going away after him. So at that time, they're recognizing Jesus' claim to messiahship. So that might be something that John is trying to bring into this. But the actual scene would be, I don't have any good visuals for people on camera, but imagine Jesus over here. But that would be like, hey, I have a weapon, I have a torch, I can fight with these things. And then you have a guy like right there in front of me, and I go like, I'm seeking Jesus of Nazareth to kill him. Technically arrest him at this time, but ultimately kill him. And that guy right there says, I am. So I have a weapon, I have a torch, I can put my torch in his face, I can stab him through. I also have a whole bunch of buddies with me who can do the exact same thing. But he says, I am, and then I just go, Hurrah! So, is that not unusual?
Yes.
Yeah.
He uses
Yes.
mind power to knock them back. and
Yeah,
Make them fall down.
yeah. Because there's the withdrawal, and then there's the fall to the ground thing. And that actually does have more specific significance for the word. So, the word to fall.
Did they fall forward or backward?
Doesn't say.
Or do we?
But the word to fall can also mean to fall prostrate. So when you fall prostrate, you are in a worship position.
Oh, right.
So there's only in two other times this particular word to fall comes up in the gospel. One is in the Lazarus narrative. So Lazarus, his sister Mary, falls to his feet and recognizes, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. So that's kind of more of a worshipful position, kind of a more respectful position. And then Jesus uses it, chapter 12, verse 24, where he's talking about a kernel of wheat falling in death and then sprouting to produce much fruit. So, yeah, one of those is fall prostrate, the other one is just to fall. But we also have John using this word a lot in the book of Revelation. That is also pretty evenly divided, almost, where there's so many people falling prostrate in worship of Christ. So this is the 24 elders up in heaven, the saints, the four living creatures. They're falling prostrate in worship of the Lamb and the Father. But you also have a whole bunch of falling in judgment, where wormwood falls and comes into the world to kill many people. People on the earth are crying to the rocks of the mountains, fall upon me so that I may be hid from God's judgment, and so on and so forth. So you have both usages here in John's work. But if we're looking to what's going on right here in John chapter 18 within the Garden of Gethsemane, this seems to be kind of a mixture of the two, where they're falling, yes, in worship, but they're also falling in judgment, because Jesus knows exactly why they're there. They're there to kill him. So they're falling in judgment before him, but they're also falling prostrate, because this is the divine name where they're recognizing Jesus' divinity. Not maybe consciously, but it seems forcefully they are being forced down to the ground.
Yeah, it seems weird. It seems like they're recognizing the I am statement, and yet they still go ahead and arrest him. I'm sorry.
I'll get to that. So there's something else that's very important to bring into that discussion. Okay. And the last word is to the ground. This is a very rare word in the New Testament. Now you have ground and land all over the place, but John uses a very specific word in Greek, which is technically an adverb. So they're falling where? They're falling to the ground. So it's an adverb. It appears only twice in the New Testament. Once here, the other time, the man born blind in John chapter 9, where Jesus spits on the ground, and from the ground uses the dirt to heal the man's eyes. So John seems to be using it for God's creation and the natural element of man. So with the man born blind, he used the ground to heal the man. So the man coming from the dust of the ground, he receives the ground in order to heal the flesh. So Jesus reappropriates the bare components of reality to repair humanity, to work in the creation. Here, though, this does seem to have a bit more of an element of judgment, where instead of Jesus bringing up ground to heal their flesh, he's bringing them down to ground. From dust you are, to dust you shall return. So there does seem to be a little bit more of an element of judgment here.
So is the mud on the eyes or directly or just the eyelids?
It just says eyes, so it can be both. Or either or. But we can see from all this is definitely a forceful action of worship, a forced action of worship, and also an immediate judgment of these men.
Do you think it was an involuntary reaction of the
Yes.
men? Yeah, they didn't do this on purpose.
Again, they're armed men there to kill this guy.
Right.
They have tons of weapons and other things. They have many buddies. And then this guy who comes out alone. like all his help is behind him. So he comes out alone and he just says, I am, and then you just go, "Bleh," and then fall immediately to the ground.
There's something different there.
Yeah. So they're not doing this by their own volition. Okay.
That would include Judas?
But this is what I'm getting at. So now Morris, though, the commentator I was using, he suggests that the men were simply taken aback by Jesus' brazeness, bumped into those behind them, and fell down. I'm going to say no, that's silly. But but apparently he wants to find a natural explanation for this. Because John's emphasis is about Jesus Christ's power and kingship, and that's what reigns for the next 2 chapters. So it doesn't make sense why this would happen, especially if Judas is counted among them. So this is what I'm getting to in a second. So at the very least, what they would have to do, if we want that natural explanation for this, is for them to say, well, this is the divine name and go down in awe before him, but that doesn't really make sense because they don't have they don't necessarily see Jesus as credible, and they won't until Jesus heals Malchus's ear, which isn't going to be coming up for a little bit now. So if we're going with the actual turn of events, they don't have any proof that Jesus is acting with the divine, or they don't want to recognize Jesus acting with the power of the divine. Okay, so what I think is helpful for understanding this is the note about Judas. So right after John records in verse 5, Jesus saying, I am, he has this note in there. And Judas the traitor was standing there with him. Why does John include that note? Well, of course, Judas is there with them. Just a couple of verses earlier, you told us that Judas led them here. Why would we assume that Judas is with them? So the importance actually seems to be the verb there, and I'm going to be translating it as had been standing. And it's really hard to capture the meaning of it, because this verb is in a tense called the pluperfect. As all grammar nerds know this, yes, because you know what the pluperfect.
I've heard of it before.
I had to look this up yesterday because I forgot. So a pluperfect is a past action that was completed in the past and has influence on a past event, but it's not necessarily occurring now. So it's a completed past action with a past implication. So if John is using the term as a pluperfect, the implication is that Judas is not standing now. He was standing with the men. And then John says, the men drew back, fell down to the ground. So Judas was standing with them at that time, and he's no longer standing now. Again, John is speaking in the present tense. So if he has a pluperfect, then that's weird because you can't assume that Judas is standing now. If Judas was standing now, that would mean that this is either a perfect or a present tense. For John does not use that. So John is using a completely different tense. So he's basically saying that as the crowd of assailants draw back and fall to the ground, Judas is among them.
Is or isn't?
Is.
Ah.
So he may have fallen too.
Yeah.
That's what I wondered. Yeah.
Also keep in mind, Judas is not alone in his flesh. He is possessed by Satan still.
Right.
Judas and Satan are forced to the ground in front of Christ.
Wow.
Oh, yeah.
So would Satan ever willingly bow the knee to Jesus? No. So this is why I'm saying that this is a divine event. Jesus is forcing the men to the ground by his word. Because if we're looking to the marker of pride, like the greatest pride there ever was, Satan, and Satan is falling to the ground in front of Christ, then Christ is exercising his divinity over him and those men.
So was this before or after Judas kissed Jesus, you figure?
As I said before, I'm thinking this is before it.
I do. I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So, what was my train of thought now? Okay.
Sorry.
Too perfect.
I wish that was.
Into that verse too.
Okay. Yeah. So, for the Good Friday service, this is the main reading of the day. So we have 2 chapters of John, chapters 18 and 19 for the Good Friday service, and it's broken up. So I don't know if you've noticed when I read through the text there, but when we come to this, I do my normal, as Jesus responds to their question, like, who do you seek? And they say, Jesus of Nazareth, and then Jesus says, I am. I do my normal thing when Jesus uses an I am statement, and I state it emphatically. But yeah, when Jesus asks them again, who do you seek? And then when they say Jesus of Nazareth, I don't know if you catch what I do in the service, but I have it quavering a little bit, where Jesus asks them the second time, and then Jesus of Nazareth, because they just got slammed to the ground by his word. So my interpretation of the text is they're concerned about things right now. And I do try to bring that out during the reading, but I don't know if you catch that when I'm reading through the biblical text. I do try to draw this out a little bit.
We'll try and remember that for next time.
Yeah, try and remember that 11 months from now.
Yeah. Right.
It's just before Easter.
I went slow. I'm sorry. We got caught on more things in chapter 17 than I thought. That was the issue. Because I thought that we would be able to get through this right before Easter, but no, it didn't happen. Anyways. Yeah, so this is very emphatic that Judas is falling with the rest and Satan with him. So it is Christ exercising his authority. So therefore, he is allowing himself to be taken. He is not taken forcefully.
Did the other gospels say this too?
John is the only one who records this event.
Pardon?
John is the only one who records this event.
Oh.
But Jesus tells the disciples named Peter to lay down arms, and he goes willingly with them. But this particular event is only John. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, when the men repeat, and we don't have word of if they're still on the ground or not. Likely they've already gone back up, but we don't have word exactly where they are. When Jesus asks again, so it could be the case. Personally, I'll just assume that they get back up, that they went to the ground and then just so confused that they just go like, oh no, and then they get back up because again they're in the presence of rebellion leaders, so they would be vulnerable on the ground, so they might just get right back up in order to try and defend themselves. But yeah, it could have actually been the case where they got thrown to the ground, and again Jesus asked them, "Who do you seek?" Jesus of Nazareth. It's like, I already told you I'm he. I could be the case. I don't know. I kind of want John to give a little bit more detail, but I'll have to ask one of the guys who was there at some point when I see them in heaven. So, and we also don't have a word that they fell down a second time. So maybe they did get back up, and then Jesus is not exercising his authority like that again, but has caused them to be more respectful to them. Or they could, be on the ground again, so they didn't need to be thrown down again because they're already down there. But regardless, Jesus speaks again, and he said, I told you I am he. So he puts extra emphasis on there. Yeah, it's where he's like, I've already said that. Well, sorry, no. He doesn't say I already said. You simply said I am. I said this. I said I am. So instead of Jesus, because if Jesus said, I already said, that places it in the immediate time. But if Jesus says, I said I am, then that kind of removes time from it. Because Jesus has been claiming throughout his ministry that he is the Almighty. He's used many I am statements. So Jesus could just be declaring this to them in general. Like, I said I am God. And if they had seen Christ before, they just could be thinking back to that and be like, yeah, he did. Yeah. So I'll end things there. We've gone well over time, as I imagined we would, because this is a lot. And we'll get into Jesus protecting the disciples next time. So let's close in prayer. Dear Lord Jesus Christ, we thank you for coming into this world to be our Savior and our Sovereign. We ask you, O Lord, to defend us from the powers of this world, sinful human beings, as well as the devil and his angels, just like you defended the disciples that were with you. We ask you, O Lord, to send your divine influence throughout the world, that all may come to worship and know you. In your name, O Lord Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen.
Amen.